Hey everybody, this is Valerie. Welcome to Latter-day Struggles. So grateful to be back here with you again. And today I have Nathan with me. How are you today, Nathan?
I am good. It's good to be back.
Good. We are here today, as promised, to break down with you, present some details and do some analysis of the LDS Personal Faith Crisis Report that was put together by a group of scholars about 10 years ago. And Nathan and I really wanted to break this down for you. This was news to us, as I have been talking to many of you through my Instagram page, Latter-day Struggles Podcast. There are a few of you who have been familiar with this. Many of you are just as new to this as I am. It has not been widely published or publicized. And so we just thought this would be really, really pertinent to our joint struggles and the work that we are doing here together, those of you who are here with us on the podcast today. Now, if you have not already done so, I would invite you to go back one episode, because I did a fairly detailed overview of what exactly this personal faith crisis report is. No need to do it. It's not mandatory, but it will give you a pretty good overview of what we're going to dig into today. So today is part 2 of a 5-part series. And we are going to run through quite a lot of background today. And then we're also going to start jumping into the demographics of the survey and give you a lot of details. In the next session, I guess that's true. I am a therapist, so I speak in terms of session. Mm-hmm. Next episode, we're going to talk a lot about the breakdown of what these scholars found a typical faith crisis looks and feels like. Okay, you guys, so Nathan and I are going to go back and forth and run you through the ins and outs of this LDS faith crisis survey. I'm going to start by talking you through the objectives. Now, some of this we're going to paraphrase, some of this we're going to read, and then we're going to do a fair amount of analyzing and just talking between ourselves about what we're making of what we have learned and are learning with you. Okay, so I'm going to open up by reading what these scholars wrote as far as what their objectives were. Okay, so here we go. The project objectives. The research team's objective is to present data on LDS personal faith crisis that can assist church leaders in, number 1, better understanding faith crisis catalysts and processes. Number 2, determining the best course of action for retaining these members currently in crisis, repairing damaged families, and mitigating the negative implications of those who are leaving or who have already left the church. And number 3, considering how best to prevent faith crisis from negatively affecting current and future generations. And so these are the objectives, the top 3 objectives of why this team donated so much of their time and energy to the putting together of this faith crisis report. Okay, so Nathan, go ahead and why don't you take it over next?
Yeah, so the thing I like about what you just said is that one of their objectives is to figure out how to fix the problem, which for me has always been a big impetus in this podcast. It's not just identifying the problem, but deciding how to fix the problem. So the first step is to identify what is the problem, what we're calling a faith crisis. Okay, so they use a very specific definition, which they say is this. It is defined as a state of intense emotional or spiritual distress resulting from the discovery of church history facts that do not align with the traditional LDS narrative. This distress then results in members losing faith in some or all of the foundational truth claims of the church itself. And I would add, and they add later, that it's not also just exclusively church history, but also some of the present day social issues contribute to it. But the point is that it is a spiritual and emotional distress that comes from an awakening to some of the things that the church has hidden from us in various capacities.
So this group of researchers then talk about the reasons why they decided to give their time and their energy and their the resources that they had, and their main resources was, of course, time. To the study of faith crisis. They said this: with the church being such a sacred, integral part of our lives, openly discussing faith crisis can be a heartbreaking task. However, the candid and expeditious analysis of this challenge is essential for these reasons. So basically, you guys, I'm not quoting now, this is just back to my own voice. is they're basically saying, while there are reasons why people may be ambivalent or fearful of actually saying these things out loud, the cost of not talking about this is far greater than the cost of talking about it. And these are the reasons why. Okay, number one, there are 4 reasons that they give. Number one, our data shows a significant number of church leaders who have traditionally been stalwart, active, and highly committed are leaving the church or lapsing into long-term inactivity, resulting in a void of local leadership. Number 2 reason to focus on faith crisis is this. Back to the quote. When long-term members go inactive as a result of faith crisis, a large ripple effect is created within the families, wards, and stakes. This ripple effect that causes others to lose their faith not be detected for months or even years from the point of first exposure. Number 3 reason to focus on faith crisis is this. Not addressing a faith crisis issue will compound the challenges of future leaders and future generations of families. And finally, number 4 reason to focus on faith crisis is this. While it is not uncommon in our recent past for, quote, left-leaning individuals to struggle in their faith over doctrinal issues such as Blacks in the priesthood or issues of LGBTQ, our data suggests an increasing number of individuals and families from, quote, the middle are also losing faith and reducing or eliminating church activity as a result of faith crisis. Anything you want to add to that, Nathan?
No, I think that's a good point, is that a faith crisis is not just about the individual, but it's about the effect on the family, the community, the ward, the future generations of children who will not grow up in the church if the parents choose to leave. All of those things have to be looked at as the potential consequences.
I think something else that I really resonated with is that some of these things are very insidious and you don't necessarily know that they're happening at the ward level. Right?
Yeah.
Until many years have gone by. But if you start accumulating data, not only from wards, but from stakes and regions, and, you know, and then it just kind of trickles out. Once you really start accumulating large amounts of data, the problem becomes far more evident. And that's the next thing that we're going to talk about for a minute here, which is the fact that what these researchers are really trying to highlight to the brethren is that their measure of metrics regarding the health of the church has been a very, very poor measure. And they actually, having looked at all of this data and analyzed it, they suggest a different measure to use so that we can better really assess the state of the health of the church. And Nathan, you're going to talk about that, right?
Yeah. So I just wanted to add one thing too,
sure.
which is that one of the things they don't mention, but they talk about later in the report, is one of the effects of a faith crisis is this, we've talked about this on our podcast too, is the coupling of faith in God with faith in the church. And the report goes on to talk about this extensively, but there is a way to save your faith in deity, even with an acknowledgement that your faith in the institution may have weakened or crumbled in some cases.
Well, and I think that's part of the larger problem here, which is part of the theology that we live in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, is a real tight coupling of God with church.
Yeah.
And so people, so when the church has successfully linked themselves so tightly with God, and then people run into faith and trust crises, their success is such that people actually lose faith not only in the church, but also in God, which in my opinion is the biggest tragedy of all.
Right. I totally agree. I think that is the biggest tragedy. So talking about the metrics of the church, the church has always taken a lot of pride in its exponential growth. In the 80s and 90s, they would proudly beam from the general conference stands in April, how many people had joined the church and what the total church membership was. And that seemed to be sort of their main metric. They also at times would use tithing dollars, but of course they never publicized that. But those are things that they would look at. And what the report points out is that there's 2 problems with that. Number one, using church membership, total church membership as a metric. Number one is that it doesn't, many people who leave the church don't resign from it. So in other words, they don't actually submit formal letters of resignation. They just walk away. The other problem with it is that there are a lot of people who do stay physically present within the boundaries of the church.
Even active, technically.
Yeah. I mean, they're coming to meetings, but emotionally and spiritually, they have completely disengaged. They can't be relied upon to become leaders, or they don't have their heart in it. And there's a different level of activity associated with it. And so it's not really a fair metric to just say, this is our total church membership, because it's not reflective of the true commitment.
Some of what we have studied and looked at shows that the actual number that is quoted is, well, let me say it this way. The real number of active, faithful Latter-day Saints is, and this is just somebody's estimate, so nothing official, but is about 1/4 of the numbers that are on the official records of the church. And that has to do, of course, with a variety of things. One of them, of course, is, well, Nathan and I both served in Spanish-speaking missions, and the attrition rate for our own experience is very high. People don't tend to stay active in the first year after they convert, at least in the mission where we served. And then you have a whole different problem, which is those multi-generational members who have chosen, for reasons of holding on to their own integrity, to leave, which is a whole different thing. But both of those are examples of how the church as a body doesn't necessarily know the state of health if they're just looking at membership numbers, because those are not going to be reflected in either of those particular issues that I just brought up. Okay. Yeah. All right. So Nathan, now you're going to talk. Okay. So Nathan's going to talk a little bit about what these researchers came up with. So as you'll remember from my last week's episode, I talked a lot about the professional qualifications and credentials of the folks that came on here and did this work. And some of these people, what they did is they looked at the way that, well, some specific reasons why not only is our church struggling, but why big institutions and big organizations and big corporate structures tend to fail. Right. And it has to do with innovation. So why don't you go ahead and pick up on that one, babe?
Yeah. So they point out in the report, this brother Clayton Christensen, who's a member of the church and also a Harvard business professor, wrote a book one time about two different types of innovation, what he called sustainable innovation and disruptive innovation. Sustainable innovation is when a corporation or a large body tries really, really hard to just keep the status quo because in the past it's worked pretty well. Disruptive innovation is when an institution or a company recognizes that what they're doing is not going to work in the future, and they are willing to scrap their model and really take a deep look at themselves and do things differently. And they use some good examples of corporations. For instance, Kodak, he uses the example of the corporation Kodak, who absolutely hung to the idea that film cameras were going to still be the wave of the future, even as digital cameras came out. And of course, Kodak has now gone the way of the dodo. Another example that's not in this report, but I think is even more indicative, is Blockbuster. Blockbuster forever held on to VHS tapes when everybody was moving to DVD and Blu-rays. And they finally moved to DVD and Blu-rays as everybody was moving to streaming. And of course, Blockbuster is now gone. They refused to look at what was happening and adjust to the real world. And so this kind of sustainable innovation, which is like, let's take a model that's a little bit old and outdated, has worked in the past, and really force it and force fit it and make it still work. It doesn't work. And that's what the point of this report is. And that's the point of Brother Christensen's research, is that we have to be willing to scrap what we've been doing, even if it's been successful in the past, and look at what's happening around us and adjust to reality.
Okay, so I want to just expand that a little bit, Nathan, and not challenge you, but I have a challenging comment to make. Is even if it has been working well. So unlike Blockbuster and Kodak, I guess you could say that it has been successful. Let me double back a little bit. The way that the church is trying to hold on to sustainable innovation is to try to manage its history and doctrine, not bearing in mind that it is no longer possible to be a correlated system where they can control all of the flow of data.
Right.
So it's been successful previously only from the perspective of it's been successful in controlling its data, even if it has not been ethical.
Right. So, I mean, you're going to touch on this in a little bit. We're going to touch on this in a little bit, but the internet is the thing that changed the sustainable model. Okay.
Precisely.
So, they use a good example here of a company that adjusted, which is Apple. I remember playing Apple computers as a kid, and they were horrible. Compaq, HP, some of these other computer companies had much better devices. And yet, Apple figured out that gaming devices were not really the wave of the future. Personal computers, phones, cell phones, watches. Apple totally adjusted its model. I don't even think you can buy an Apple gaming system anymore. But they were able to say, hey, here's what's going on, and we're going to adjust to it. Now, of course, they're the second largest company in the world. And so for the church, the internet has been the game changer.
The internet has pressured the integrity of the church in its former ways of controlling and managing its data.
Yep.
And so what they have struggled in keeping up with is that beginning in the mid 90s, they didn't realize, or they realized, slowly and surely, that they were no longer able to manage the data that was becoming prolific on the internet. And they needed to get honest with themselves and with us. And short of becoming honest with themselves, what they are, which, again, they're sort of doing this. We are demanding as a body that they become honest with us if we are going to continue to give them our loyalty and love as an institution.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the next point here is these researchers talked about what are the primary factors driving faith crisis. And so I'm going to go fairly quickly over a couple of these points because we just talked about them. Okay, so they mentioned 4 main points that are the drivers of faith crisis. Number 1 is unprecedented access to uncorrelated information. I'm going to give you just a little tiny bit of a history on this. The church really jumped into a heavy effort to correlate everything starting in about the late 50s. And for about a 2-decade period, they were really, really focused on making sure that everything looked pretty much the same church-wide and worldwide. Part of that correlation effort was actually also taking the voice away from the women of the church. And so they became very tightly correlated in the mid to late 70s. And then, of course, you hit about 1995, and it all starts to crumble when the internet became when the internet became available. But it also became even harder to correlate due to this second point, which is this continual access. Okay, sorry. So let me just double back. Point number 1 is unprecedented access to uncorrelated information. Point number 2 is continual access to uncorrelated information. Okay, point number 3 is unprecedented content creation and consumption. Okay, so this even actually, so you have the internet come in, and that is one wave of massive change where things were not correlated. Then you have the increase of availability of content on the internet. And just for our purposes, just talking about the church, some of this is true. Some of this is not true. Okay. But it's all out there. And then the second piece is that we also started having uninterrupted access. So there are 2 points that we can talk about regarding the advent of the internet. The first one is where it was desktop and laptop only, which is when people would get on the internet. And of course, they had access to this information, but they only had it at certain points of their day. They were not always looking at it because that's not where we were yet as a culture. And then you move on to the next phase, which is when the smartphone was invented with the internet on it. And all of a sudden, not only do we have unprecedented access, but we have access that is basically available. We have this available to us from the moment we wake up until the moment we fall asleep. And so it was absolutely almost like a tsunami of not only information, but the information was coming in all of the time. Okay. And then point number 4 is what they're calling the Mormon moment, which is in the early 2000s. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was getting unprecedented attention in the press. Some examples are the presidential election of Mitt Romney, of course, the infamous Prop 8 that happened in California that put us on the map and in the news for all the wrong reasons. The Book of Mormon musical did its share of putting us on the map and giving us a lot of attention. Then there were a couple of HBO shows, Big Love being one of them, that really exposed a lot of some of the counterculture, but still it was giving the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints or the Mormon movement something, some more more traction, where people learned about us. And then, of course, the trial of Warren Jeffs. All of these happened in those first several years of the turn of the century. And all of a sudden, we are on the map for a variety of reasons, where pop culture was actually really, really looking at us. And these are situations, some of which are positive, some of which are negative, but they really started demanding that those of us in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints start having a little bit more critical awareness about who we were, what we believe, how we're perceived. Okay, so each of these four factors really started driving faith crisis for some people, because they became aware that they were ill-equipped to deal with so much information, be it from the internet or from all of these pop cultural sources. Okay, so Nathan, I'm going to, oh wait, you sound like you had something to say.
Well, I was just going to add, because the pop culture sources, one of the things they did though is they brought a lot of media attention.
Correct.
The media attention, as we have learned in the past, does have an effect on the church. The church is really concerned about its image.
Yeah.
Its public image. And so as the media attention from all of these things began to pop up, the church had kind of this double whammy. Number one is that there's all the stuff on the internet that people were searching privately, but then there was the mass presentation of information on sources like the AP and CNN, where they were coming in large groups to people who weren't even looking for that information. And so, yeah, they're just getting bombarded both privately and publicly.
Okay, so Nathan is going to talk in just a second about some of the demographics of this survey. But before he does that, I'm going to just mention a little bit about the methodology. And I feel like I want to do this for full disclosure reasons, because these surveyors, this is what, when you do, I've done research classes and things like that. And so this is a really important piece of the ethics of running a survey and then publishing it, is they want to talk about its strengths and its limitations. And so one of the things that they said is, given the lack of budget, the survey sample was not randomly selected. The survey does not claim to be predictive in nature or in statistical significance. That said, the data collected are considered a robust ethnographic study of the faith crisis cohort, and many points of this analysis are indicative of the experiences of many people in the church who pass through faith crisis. So, okay, so I wanted to just say that, because what they're basically saying is, did this run through an IRB, which is basically a university board that looks through all of the qualifications for something? It did not. However, they're basically saying it still is a very, very good and robust measurement of what is typically found in a cohort of people going through the same experience. Because what ended up happening is as they looked at the data, and as especially they looked at the ethnographic experiences or the essays of the people, they started noticing the same trends coming up over and over and over again, which is how you know you have a robust survey. Okay, so Nathan, why don't you take over for just a quick minute and talk about the demographic findings. If you guys want details about these demographics, I would encourage you to go to the link that is going to be in the show notes, because there's no way we could effectively really talk you through all of these, because there are so many visuals. But Nathan's going to go ahead and do a little bit of an overview of the demographics of what they found were of some interesting characteristics they found in the 3,000 people that they surveyed that gave us the information that we're walking you guys through today.
Yeah, so they surveyed a little over 3,000 people. And so first they were looking for who are we talking to, and then they took another look at what were they talking about. And there's a little bit of a difference there. So this is interesting, because when I was on my mission, the University of North Carolina coupled with the University of Michigan, and they did a study about faith in America. And one of the things they determined was that the more educated and the more wealthy you were, the more likely you were to not be active in a church. But they made a very notable exception for the LDS church, which was that in the late 80s and early 90s, the wealthier and more educated you were, the more likely you were to be active in the LDS faith. It was the opposite of other traditional Christian faiths. Okay.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. Now, what this new survey shows is that that is no longer the case. So what we saw in this survey is that the vast majority of the respondents were under the age of 50, and more than half of them were under the age of 40. So we're talking about 20s and 30s. Okay. So it's the people who kind of grew up with the internet, that when they were teenagers and when they were younger, the internet was just kind of part of their lives. And then generations like me and Valerie, who adopted the internet but maybe weren't quite as young when it was available to us. And so we didn't dive into it quite as young as some of these respondents.
Can I say something there, Nathan? I think one thing to notice that I at least picked up on myself as I was studying this is, remember, you guys, this was published. The data was researched and analyzed in 2011 and published in 2013. Okay, so we're 10 years out of that, and we're 10 years deeper into an understanding of the internet, meaning that there's a whole decade where those of us who maybe 10 years ago, and I think you and I would definitely fall into that, Nathan, we were not very internet savvy as young parents.
Right.
And so we were probably not going to be the demographic that was going to be stumbling into some of this stuff 10 years ago. But now, 10 years later, I think if you did a demographic study, I think because we're all this many more years into the internet, I would imagine those demographics would actually shift upward. And,
upward a little bit.
And the reason why I'm saying that is I know that from a lot of our small groups that we're starting to run, they are older than the 30s.
Yeah.
There's some in the 30s, but there's quite a few in 40s and 50s too.
Yeah. So a little bit more than half of the people that responded were men, which is, in my mind, not surprising. 70% were married, which again is not surprising in the LDS church. And then the vast majority were from the United States and Canada. Little less than half were from Utah, but I think it was somewhere on the 90% or so. Yeah, 90% were from the United States, including Utah. So other things that were interesting, more than 75% of them had some level of college education, whether that be some college, finished college, master's degree, or something higher than a master's degree. And many of them, a large percentage of them, I'm looking at the percentages right now, but you're looking at somewhere on the order of about 60% of them made more than $100,000 a year.
Wow.
And so we're not talking about the uneducated or the poor. We are talking about high income earners, highly educated, married, and in the wealthy confines of the United States.
Well, and I think that's what the church has always really catered itself. Its breadbasket, as they call it, is the United States. These are who the church goes to for their leadership
and tithing,
and for their tithing.
Yep.
And so, if there's one thing that tends to motivate the church, it's oftentimes the tithing dollars. And this faith crisis situation is massively impacting the tithing dollars that are flowing into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So you would think that might motivate them a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's see here. Was there anything else you wanted to say about demographics?
I want to tell a funny story about tithing while I've got 2 seconds.
Okay.
Do you remember when we were in Houston and the church was doing this massive media campaign, and we had a meeting. There was a regional meeting we all went to, and the 70 who was speaking at this meeting temporarily lost his filter. And he basically says we're targeting our messages to the wealthy areas of the city because we are trying to see if we can increase the tithing base. And
Wow.
he's giving this talk in the middle of poor downtown Houston.
Yeah, we were not in a rich ward. We were in a very poor ward.
We were in a student ward, and we had lots of minorities and lots of socioeconomically challenged people. And he just flat out says, we're targeting the wealthy areas of the city to see if we can increase the tithing base through a media campaign. And there were a couple of people of color who were present in that meeting, and they did not take that well.
Yeah, well, rightfully so.
One lady just flat out stood up and said, "What are you saying? What are you saying about me and my, and I thought, you're right.
Yeah.
Get him, sister." So
good for her.
But
yeah, that's terrible.
Unfortunately, that is the attitude the church has had.
Wow. Okay. So let's move on to talking a little bit about, so let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the reasons that people leave, the findings, reasons why people leave, and the repercussions, what they go through because of leaving. Okay, so I'm going to just, once again, I'm going to review this with you and encourage you. There are a lot of graphs and visuals. If you go ahead and go to the study itself on the show notes, you'll be able to actually look at all of these. Okay, so the stated reasons for loss of belief. The top 4 were, I ceased to believe in the doctrine and theology of the church. Number 2 is I studied church history and I lost my belief. Number 3 is I lost my faith in Joseph Smith. Number 4 is I lost my faith in the Book of Mormon. From there, it goes on to talk about struggles with general authority, stance on women, not feeling spiritually edified, the LGBTQ movement being a big reason, the stance on race issues, science issues, struggles with church culture, changing one's own ideas of what it means to believe and know, confidence in local leaders. And then these are a couple of the sad ones. These are about 2/3 the way down. They left because they lost their faith in God and Jesus Christ. These are probably connected to the top four, would be my assumption.
Yeah.
The overlinking of church with relationship with God.
Yep.
And then it moves on clear to the bottom to I was offended by someone, or I wanted alcohol or extramarital sex. Now, I want to make sure we highlight that, because that has been the line that has been fed to us as to why people leave. This goes ahead. This really emphasizes, folks, what, like, the disconnect between what the orthodoxy claims is why people leave the church and why they actually leave the church. Those were very, very, very low numbers of people who said that that's why they left the church. Almost none.
Yeah, and as a percentage, it only appeared on like 1 or 2% of surveys.
It was minuscule.
That I was offended by somebody, or I wanted to, break the laws of the church, and that's why I left.
Yeah, very minimal.
And yet there's a lot of conference talks about this.
Absolutely.
I'm thinking David Bednar's talk about, don't get offended. And it's like he blames the exodus of a lot of members on being offended. And this survey, among disenchanted members said, nope, that actually didn't play into it.
Yeah. Okay. So other reasons, if you wanted to jump specifically into church history struggles, this is what the folks in the survey said were the main reasons why they left, if it had to do with church history. The top reason was issues around the book of Abraham. The second was polygamy and polyandry. From there, it goes down. Number 3 is the priesthood temple ban with blacks. Number 4 is DNA in the Book of Mormon. Then it goes on to talk about Masonic ties to temple ceremonies was troubling to many people. Then they were struggling with multiple versions of the first vision, women in the priesthood, anachronisms in the Book of Mormon, church positions on science, changes to temple ceremony, credibility on priesthood restoration, blood atonement, Book of Mormon translation, the Adam God theory, Mountain Meadows massacre, the loss of credibility of the 3 witnesses, something called the Kinderhook plates, which I think you looked up, but I don't even actually know what that is.
Not familiar.
It's toward the bottom.
Hasn't played into my face.
And then the very last 3 is the Joseph Smith history with treasure digging, Mark Hoffman scandal, and the view of the Hebrews. Okay, so the top 2 were Book of Abraham and polygamy, polyandry. If you're interested in more about polygamy and polyandry, go to my episode number 35 on this podcast, and that gives you a lot about a way to think about polygamy and polyandry. Okay, so just a little bit about the repercussions, what people felt and went through when they went through this faith crisis. And if I were to tell you what was the most, it's a tie for a lot of things, but this was very, very troubling to me when I was absolutely inhaling this faith crisis report. The social repercussions were devastating for these folks. Those who disclosed their faith crisis doubts reported that they actually went through a social excommunication, even if they never went through a formal excommunication, meaning that the idea that one was going through a faith crisis was so estranging and isolating and ostracizing to some people that they went through massive emotional and mental and spiritual anguish because of the way they were treated by LDS family and friends. Ouch.
Yeah.
That's heartbreaking. That's boy, there's so much I could say there. The next thing that they talked about is that, over 50% of active members in the Faith Crisis Report talked about a severe cost to relationships and their emotional health. So that's why this is a big deal. This is life changing for people that go through faith crisis. Not only has the foundation of who they are and what they believe, why they're here, what they're doing, where they're going, not only is that sort of taken from them, it's ripped out from underneath them, but then when they have the courage and the vulnerability to share with their loved ones what they're going through, they're ostracized. And so this is it's like the 1-2 punch, which causes massive amounts of emotional, psychological, spiritual pain. Circle back to 2 episodes before this one if you want me to. I talk a lot about the very real trauma that many of us go through in faith crisis. Okay, now I want to read to you a couple of things that another repercussion is massive and complete feelings of betrayal by the institution that these folks have loved so much. I'm going to just read you a few quotes of what people said that were these respondents in the Faith Crisis Report. One of them says, it's not any one of these historical issues, but it's the accumulation of these combined issues and with the church's lack of addressing these concerns on their own. So lack of accountability is one of the main reasons why people were more wounded even than the issues themselves. Here's another quote. This respondent says, I defended the church to associates who brought up some historical issues. When I did my own research, I found they were true. My issue wasn't that they were true, but that for my whole life, I had never been told about them. I feel betrayed by the church. Another quote here, I feel like I cannot trust the general leadership in any spiritual issues because they cannot even be honest and open about our past. So much betrayal that people felt like they had to do something to stay in their own honor. And my last quote here is, the church needs to be honest with its history and contradictions. Instead, they make us who have discovered these complicated facts look like we are the evil ones. I am shunned by my family. They think I am a liar and a deceiver when it is the church and the general authorities who have deceived us. So this is one of the many responses from people that went through this interview and had suffered or are suffering through faith crisis. And the main point that keeps sort of coming up over and over again is a feeling of betrayal, a feeling that they had been loyal to this thing that is so deeply embedded in what it means to be them. It's a part of their identity. It's a part of what has crafted in them their characteristics, their beliefs, their loves, their sense of reality, their sense of immortality and eternal life. And then when that institution, when they learn that institution has betrayed them, it's incredibly psychologically wounding and damaging. And for that reason, so many people do, they feel like they have to go. But the sad part is most of the time, or oftentimes when they go, the struggles and the issues that are so painful for them, of course, do not just go away. They are trauma victims. Okay, why don't we go ahead and have you, do you want to do the survey findings, the overview of the survey findings?
Yeah. So just going back to what you're saying, if you don't mind.
Sure. Sorry.
If I could say a couple things.
Please.
You hear over and over in general conference when people brush over church history, they'll say things like, don't focus on one thing that one person said one time, or don't let a particular issue from church history, don't dwell on a particular issue from church history. And what they're basically doing is they're just continuing the lie, which is that there are lots of things from church history that have been hidden. There are lots of things that are very questionable. There are lots of things that don't align with what we teach and believe now. And to say things like, oh, don't focus on one thing or one person is basically making us, they're gaslighting us. They're saying, Guy, you're blowing this thing out of proportion. This is ridiculous. And it's a lie, and it's got to stop. And it will stop, because they're not going to have anybody attending General Conference before too long once everybody catches on to this thing. But I don't understand why it's so hard for them to just be accountable and say, yeah, we have glossed over lots and lots and lots of things, and it's time to talk about it honestly. I can completely relate to what these people are saying. An institution that taught me to be honest has been lying. And I'm not saying there's not good in the church, but they have been lying, and they have been hiding things. So
it's deception. There's been a lot of deception.
Yeah. Okay. So key survey findings. The significant majority of the survey respondents represented long-term members who until recently were actively engaged in holding church leadership callings. Leadership callings. Number two, members in faith crisis tended to be married, more educated than average, and higher than average income earners. A little less than half of those who disbelieved remained active in the church, while slightly over half no longer attended. We didn't touch on that, but we mentioned that there was kind of this disconnect between people who actually had their names removed and people who had just kind of fallen out of the radar. But it's about half and half. And we're going to talk about that more in our next episode, actually.
I think that's really significant that a lot of people in faith crisis are still trying to navigate relationship with the church as technically active members, but they're in massive amounts of distress, which I think, again, that is going to come across as invisible to the leadership of the church because they still see the butts in the seats.
Yeah. So the majority who left the church did so in the past 7 years. So in other words, this is a fairly new phenomenon. Now, the survey's 10 years old, so that number has probably gone up.
I'm sure it's gone up a ton.
But it is sort of spiraling more recently. Number 5, among the issues, historical issues that bug people, we have the Book of Abraham, you have polygamy and polyandry, and some other significant historical factors that led to the loss of belief. Number 6, although some factors rate higher than others, respondents indicated that the exposure to several factors collectively contributed to their disbelief.
So people didn't tend to say that one thing broke the proverbial shelf.
Right.
Is that the shelf got loaded up and it broke after a number of issues, which I think is, once again, you guys, it's very significant that this is not, these struggles in the church, it's not a one-hit wonder.
Yeah.
It's multiple hits that have been endured and tolerated until sometimes people finally no longer can tolerate the gravity of the issues around lack of accountability.
Yeah, so I'm thinking back to Sunstone at the TEDx talk of an ex-member who said that he had really struggled with lots and lots of different issues, and he was really trying hard to hold them, all the same issues we're talking about. But he said what broke his back was when he heard Elder Ballard say, "The church has never intentionally tried to hide its history." And he said, when I heard that, I was done. And I understand where he's coming from on that, because that is a blatant lie. The church has tried to hide its history. Yeah. It would have been much better to say, hey, we are sorry that we haven't done a better job of being straightforward and honest and forthcoming about church history. Well, but to say the church has never tried to hide its history, for this guy was the shelf breaker. And for me, it's absolutely a dishonest statement.
Well, and I think it's amplified by the fact that right before Elder Ballard said that, in a face-to-face,
right,
he had actually just presented a beautiful sermon to CES employees where he had absolutely been accountable.
Right.
And so it was actually an about face within about a year where he had said one thing and then he had gone back and unsaid the entire thing and denied that had ever happened. And I think that kind of a whiplash was incredibly impactful to a lot of people whose shelves were already, really, really at the breaking point.
Yeah. Okay. So point number 7, spouses tended to be aware of the faith crisis issue. Church leaders and friends may have been less aware. Members in faith crisis who attend church regularly tend to suffer the most mental and spiritual anguish as a result of discovering these issues. Number 9, for many, faith crisis extracts an extremely high cost in spousal and familiar relationships. And number 10, a strong sense of betrayal usually accompanies the member's loss of faith.
One of the things I want to highlight as we kind of close up, Nathan, is your point number 9. Well, it's not your point number 9. Their point number 9 that you just read is the cost that is exacted, extremely high cost that is exacted amongst spouses and family members when someone goes through a faith crisis. That's something that we're going to spend actually quite a bit of time on. Not so much in this series, but I actually have someone on the docket, a guest who's going to come in and talk a lot about the impact that faith crisis has on actually breaking up and disintegrating families, which in and of itself is devastating, because if we as a church purport to be, deeply committed to the eternal nature and the importance of family, not only in this life, but in the eternities, what we have started to discover, and what this report is really articulating well, is that if we don't deal with what happens in faith crisis, we are absolutely destroying families. It's breaking up marriages. It's turning fathers and mothers against each other. And only because someone is having an honest and integrity-based struggle with the church, that is ruining marriages. That's estranging children from their parents. And the reason why is because people don't tend to understand in the orthodoxy the very, very real and legitimate struggle that people in faith crises are going through. And so it's a deep misunderstanding that is causing the breaking up of actual families, which is incredibly paradoxical for a church who prides itself in being so committed to helping strengthen not only families in this life, but families for eternity. And so if that is the only reason why we address this issue, to save marriages, to save families, to help families understand one another, and to dignify the real struggles of people going through faith crisis because they are doing something that's in their own integrity and calling out that which needs and deserves to be called out, then that alone is enough reason to really commit ourselves as a church to look at faith crisis and get honest with ourselves.
Yeah.
Okay. Did you have anything you want to say?
Well, so it's just another example of the incorrect integration of two totally separate principles, right? We already talked about how, faith in the church or loss of faith in the church shouldn't affect our faith in God, and it shouldn't affect our marriage. But because the church makes itself such an integral part of everything, and it ties itself to our marriage and it ties itself to our faith, that if the church crumbles, those other things necessarily crumble, and it shouldn't be that way.
It's heartbreaking. It upsets me deeply that the church has imposed itself so deeply into the hearts and minds of underdeveloped human beings that they would actually choose an institution over the person that they have given their life to share with.
Yeah, or the person they worship.
Right.
Yeah, it's terrible.
Yeah. It's very, very sad. So, okay, you guys, we have downloaded a lot of information here. So grateful to have you guys here. Next time, what we're going to do is we're going to go through the stages of faith crisis that these researchers did a phenomenal job in outlining. Nathan and I are going to go through this with you on our next episode. So stay with us. If I've said it before, I'm saying it again with 10 times more force, you guys. I want you to please, please, please share this episode. I have a couple of reasons for asking this of you. First and foremost, I want people who are suffering to know that they're not alone. I want them to feel that what they've gone through is a phenomenon, because when we suffer, most of the time the suffering is amplified because we don't feel like we feel alone. We feel like nobody gets us. I want people to know that they're not alone who have gone through this, who are currently going through this. The second reason why I want this to be shared is especially when we are able to, if we have the courage to share it with our Orthodox family members, it will help them understand the nature of the problem that they are participating in, that they, unbeknownst to themselves, are actually perpetrating abuse on those of us who have struggled with faith crisis. So if you have the courage to post these on your social media, to put these episodes on Facebook or Instagram or wherever you go to share in your circles, I would invite you and encourage you to please, please do so, because I would really like people to better understand the nature of what we're going through as a church and as families. Okay, finally, if you have not already done so, I would invite you to please review this podcast on on Google, iTunes, iTunes or Spotify. My goodness. Okay, yeah, review and rate this. It helps this podcast grow. Thanks to your generosity in sharing this podcast is growing rapidly. But please, if you are one that has received this from somebody, it is now your turn to share with many people in your circle. Please share this. We would like to start or continue to have this information become broad and widely known. All right, you guys, so good to be with you here. I'm so grateful to be in connection with so many of you. If you are one that would like to be directly supported in a small group community where I facilitate, please reach out to me on Instagram at Latter-day Struggles Podcast or via email at info@ValerieHamaker.com. Okay, you guys, good to be with you all. We will see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.